Yes, I was born in Sri Lanka in 1962, but came to the UK as a small child with my family. I settled in West London. It was a time when there was quite a lot of open racism. Enoch Powell, the politician, became quite famous for some of his speeches in which he talked about how terrible it was to have such a wave of immigrants and how this was undermining British culture. There was also a pushback against it, but I think growing up as part of an ethnic minority in London at that time did have its challenges, though obviously it was easier in areas which were quite mixed than it might have been for people in, say, very small towns or rural areas where there were hardly any people of African or Asian descent. I suppose growing up then, it was quite obvious that I was part of a minority, but perhaps it took longer to become aware that I was part of one or two other minorities as well in terms of sexuality. There were not a lot of positive images of lesbian and gay people in those days. I think of bisexual and transgender people, probably even fewer. And those who were visible were almost exclusively white. So it was quite difficult to imagine oneself as a black lesbian. And obviously as a small child, one's concept of sexuality is rather different from what happens later. I think children in those days probably didn't have quite as much exposure to information about sex and sexuality that children do now. This is way before the advent of the internet being widely available and so on. So visibility was relatively low. I think it was probably fairly obvious at a very early age that I didn't fit in very well with feminine stereotypes, so to speak. But I was quite lucky in that my family allowed that. So I was allowed to have a fair deal of freedom to be who I was. And then by about 12, by which time I had moved to Stoke Newington, my family having been homeless for a bit and then getting rehoused there, I began to become aware of being attracted to girls and women rather than boys and men, and that this made me very different from my schoolmates. I was very careful not to let them find out. So I was quite scared about that, and also I had just assumed that the only valid way of being sexual was by a man and a woman in a kind of marriage type partnership. And I was and am an Anglican, and at that time that was a conventional point of view. In fact, I think across society as a whole, most people tended to assume that the most moral form of relationship had to be between a man and a woman, though some bold people were questioning that, and there was a lesbian and gay rights movement that had grown up. I mean, I think the women's movement as well provided some space for exploring different ideas around gender and sexuality, but it was still a time when there was a lot of pressure to fit into certain ideals of being male and female and settling down together, and male domination, of course, being part of that, though in more progressive families like mine, that would have been contested. So there I was at 12, 13, 14, trying to figure out my sexuality and not be too conspicuous about it, but not able to join in the general fervour for boy bands or the schoolboys down the road whacking one another with satchels as objects of admiration and love. And not being particularly interested in magazines like Jackie that sort of showed how girls should be, or makeup, or being particularly feminine. Though obviously some lesbians, some young lesbians do fit in more with that kind of maybe outward appearance of femininity, while inside having maybe a different way of looking at the world. So I think it was an interesting time. The doors had been opened by an earlier generation of pioneers, and I think I and others of my generation have a lot to be grateful for, that we weren't in the same position that people would have been 15, 20 years earlier, where there would have been far less opportunities. For gay men, there would have been criminal sanctions if they expressed their sexuality. People were arguing for equal rights, and I did know a handful of people who were out lesbians and gays, which made things easier. But I was still trying to figure out who I was, and going into the library and reading books rather nervously, just in case somebody I knew spotted that I was reading about what it was to be gay or lesbian, and appreciating those who wrote positively about it, because it was a little after that era when people were very often sent off to be corrected, so to speak, and have their sexuality rewired, which didn't work and caused a lot of mayhem. Yes, and I think by about 14, I had figured out that I was definitely, or that I was probably more interested in or more attracted to females than males. I thought for a bit in the flush of adolescence maybe I could be just about attracted enough to a man to get involved in a long-term relationship, and then by about 16 it was apparent that I was unlikely to be able to make much of a go of heterosexuality, so to speak. I had also been thinking very much about the ethical aspects of that, and I suppose thinking also through reading fiction as well as factual information, and it became apparent that that same-sex relationships could be long-term ones of great depth, as well as heterosexual relationships. This may seem glaringly obvious today, but it wasn't at the time, because there was a kind of assumption that lesbian and gay relationships would either be very fleeting and superficial, or they would end in misery, or they would be terribly possessive, or one partner or the other would replicate the sort of the worst patterns of heterosexual relationships, but without the long-term aspects of that usually. So there was a sense that relationships were less valid, less loving, but I think it became clear to me that that didn't have to be the case, and that the feelings associated with being attracted to the same sex weren't just about sexual pleasure, or anticipating that when I got round to having sexual relationships, which I wasn't having as an adolescent. It didn't happen till I was in my 20s, but that it was about something more than desire. It was also about valuing people, tenderness, care, mutuality and love. And that changed my view. So I was able to reconcile that for me with being a Christian, and that for me was crucially important. And I think I'd kind of reached that realization by about 17, 18. So by the time I started university, I think I had come to terms with myself, my feelings, and the fact that it wouldn't be necessary for me to be celibate for the rest of my life in order to lead an ethical life. I think in Hackney in the 1970s, there was probably quite a large or growing lesbian community, but this wasn't immediately visible growing up there on a council estate. So it was a case of maybe getting bits of information here and there about sexuality, doing a lot of reading. I think reading made a lot of difference to me. I'm somebody who tends to read a fair amount if there's something I don't understand, and hope eventually that I get to understand it better. So that, I think, made a difference. I wouldn't really have been in position to go off to the West End, and I think there would have been much less that would have been young person friendly when I was growing up. I think slightly later on there were more youth clubs and projects that were targeting young LGBT people, but at that time there was very little. And certainly there wouldn't have been a burgeoning nightlife locally. It was a very different time. Yes, I mean, I had flagged up my sexuality briefly with my parents, who I think seemed uncomfortable with the notion of me being lesbian. Eventually, as the time got nearer when they would be spending more of their time in Sri Lanka, my mother having taken early retirement, I raised it again because I wanted to know whether they would reject me, and they made it clear that they wouldn't, though I think at that time they were still struggling with the implications of that. So that was a real relief. I mean, looking back on it, probably there was never any real risk of my being rejected, but I think a lot of people have that fear, even today, that they will lose that bond with family members, and thankfully that didn't happen. My older siblings were supportive and have been ever since, so that was good. But it was, I suppose, a step. It was a matter of moving forward step by step towards letting people know about my sexuality. So even among my friends, I was very tight-lipped about my feelings because I didn't know how people would react. Yes, I think I think going to university offered an opportunity, especially in a city like London, rather than say something like a campus university, to not only study under people with a lot of knowledge and experience in their field, but also to be part of a London nightlife, or I suppose cultural scene. So there were cinemas showing films about sexuality that might throw more light on being lesbian or gay, bookshops, places to go, coffee shops. It was possible in central London to buy the occasional lesbian or gay publication, remembering this is years before such things were available online. But if you went to certain booksellers or magazine sellers, you might be able to get something like I think it was Gay News or Gay Times. So there were opportunities for finding out more about oneself. I think I knew that being in London would give me more opportunities than I would have in many other places, and that turned out to be the case. I suppose I wouldn't have known everything that would be available, but I did know that student life would give me greater freedom, especially if I weren't living at home, and that turned out to be so. It wasn't necessarily a matter of going to lots of wild night parties, especially because as an engineering student you had to get up a lot of the time by 9 a.m. the next day and be awake enough to take in the lectures. There wasn't really the opportunity, and I said a lot of energy to run wild, or it was perhaps harder. But it was a chance, I suppose, to explore things more fully and to have access to all that the city offered, and not just what was on campus in the university. So there was both that opportunity to mix with a range of students, have different student societies offering different kinds of activities, and also to mix more widely, to become involved in groups. For instance, in terms of lesbian and gay groups, there were a number, but I think there would have probably been more in the big cities than there would have been in smaller towns and villages. Yes, I think there were very few of us at the time. There were a number of students of African, Asian and Latin American descent, but a lot of those were overseas students. But there weren't very many women students in general, so in some ways it was quite isolated. That having been said, there were a number of students I got on well with, and a handful of people who were closer friends, and that was very helpful as I gradually edged towards the point when I was ready to come out. At that stage, I think I was aware that there was a gay society, and it did make a difference having that there, that knowledge of having out lesbian and gay people, I think having one student union officer who was an out gay man, and knowing that there were bits of the campus where it was quite acceptable, but that didn't really seem to have spread very much to the engineering faculty. By and large, though, I think I enjoyed my time at UCL. I was involved in a number of student societies, though I think I got rather distracted by other things as well, including anti-racist campaigning, largely outside. I've been involved, I suppose, in the anti-racist movement for quite a while, and there were a lot of things happening at that time, for instance, around the right to self-defence against the far right and the failure of the police to deal with racist violence. In fact, their often oppressive behaviour towards young people of Asian and African descent. So there was a lot going on outside as well as inside university, but that too had its plus points, because it did begin to bring me into contact with people who brought together different aspects of my identity, people who were both minority ethnic and openly LGBT. Meanwhile, back in the chemical engineering department, I think around the second year, I mentioned in a conversation with my closest friend, who was a male student, a Muslim from the Middle East, that I was lesbian, and there was no negative reaction on his part, which was really helpful. So I think I had grown in confidence, and when I began the final year, I think I was willing to come out more generally, though I didn't know how people would react. I had figured out that it was probably easier to come out for a woman than a man in the very macho environment that we were in, and that statistically it was possible that I was the only lesbian in the chemical engineering department because there were so few women. And so if anybody was going to come out, it might as well be I. So I did. I was very lucky. I didn't have any really negative reactions. I think there was some surprise, and maybe some people took a bit of time to actually believe that I was lesbian, because there was still that perception that lesbians and gays were kind of slightly exotic creatures out there somewhere else, people who were somehow very different rather than just people who were in the same courses oneself. Yes, that was positive. I was also lucky in terms of the other Christians at University College London. Now, the churches have traditionally not always been very good around sexuality and acceptance of diversity. In fact, still in terms of sexual orientation and gender diversity, a lot of church leaders struggle, as do some leaders of other faith communities. A lot of people are accepting, but they don't want to push it too far in case they upset often just a handful of people who are not accepting but very vocal. So there tend to be a lot of debates in churches, and there were some debates going on even in the late 70s and early 80s, in that period of 1979 to 1982 when I was studying at UCL, and just before and afterwards. And that created a context in which I came out in a meeting of, I think, the Anglican Society and Christian Union. While many people's experiences of Christian unions has been negative, mine was okay. I think some of the members there would have been rather thrown by my coming out as lesbian, but they had known me for a while by then, so that made it easier. And I had done a lot of thinking, so I was less likely to be thrown by other people being thrown, so to speak. So I suppose having that long delay in coming out was stressful in some ways, but it did mean that I felt more confident about my ground and why I thought what I thought, including the belief that there was nothing wrong in itself in having same-sex relationships, that they should be judged by the same criteria as being in a relationship with somebody of the opposite sex. By the time that I did come out, I didn't get involved with a partner at that stage. That was a number of years later. but it was useful to have the gay sock, which I started to attend. At that point, in terms of terminology, a lot of things might have just been labelled gay. A few years later, they might have then been labelled as lesbian and gay. There was still a lot of bisexual invisibility and I think some prejudice within lesbian and gay circles, and this probably applied even more to transgender people, though there were some trans people around in LGBT circles, and gradually, very gradually, I suppose a black lesbian and gay movement was growing up, which would have incorporated some people who were B and T, even if their visibility wasn't very great within it. And that became more apparent, I think, a little after I had left university. But by the early 80s, I later discovered, a few groups were beginning to get together, that using black in the broad sense in which it was often used in those days and occasionally is now, applying to people of African, Asian and Latin American descent primarily. There was perhaps greater awareness of diversity within black communities, and also greater awareness that LGBT people weren't simply white or white people of a particular type. UCL was a very mixed place. So I think there were some departments where it was relatively okay to be LGBT and out. Some departments which were pretty hostile, and where there could have been very strong reactions against. And then quite a lot of departments, including, I suspect, quite a lot of the Faculty of Engineering, certainly my department, where LGBT people were just invisible. And so there wasn't necessarily much hostility expressed, at least that I heard. There might have been some common prejudices around, but it wasn't a case where people were necessarily very negative. It was just that there was very little recognition of that as a possibility, very little recognition that LGBT people were around. It's not the largest city, but certainly one of the most diverse at that time, I think. And in terms of the scene, there was a scene, but perhaps not of the same scale as there is now. I wasn't very active on the scene. I mean, I didn't spend a lot of time going out to pubs and clubs. And these would have been very much in central London, perhaps a few in East London or other parts of London. But if you were in the know, you might know where to go. It was less easy to find out where if you weren't, though I think the work of helplines was very important, and beginning to get more awareness of those particular helplines that would direct a lot of people to places to meet others, whether it was support groups or the scene, or simply have a conversation where people's reality was acknowledged for the first time. So that was really valuable, and credit to those volunteers and handful of staff who made that possible. So there was a growing movement, including a political or partly political movement. Some of those who had campaigned for equality before and were continuing to campaign for greater equality, take on widespread discrimination. At that time, there was no protection from discrimination, I think, or at least in the mid-70s. And then gradually case law began to develop, where judges had found that people were being unfairly treated at work, but it was, or in public services, but there was still very little protection around against being victimised or discriminated against on grounds of sexuality or gender identity. So it was a time when change was underway, but there was still a long, long way to go. And of course, any attempts at change, at progress, brought a backlash, and I think we experienced some of that at UCL when I was a student. So I think there was an attack on the office of an out gay student union officer, if I remember correctly, when I was a student. And outside as well, sometimes in a more genteel or law-abiding way, people who didn't like the way that things were changing, didn't like greater diversity in general, were pushing back against it. About 3 years after I finished at University College London, I found a job at the Black, Lesbian and Gay Centre Project, a London-wide organisation that was the first of its kind. But if I hadn't, I suppose, had that opportunity to come out and had a positive reception and been in a space where that happened, it would have been harder for me to become part of that and other types of activism afterwards. So being at UCL did play a part in opening the door to some of my future activities. I mean, I didn't do very well at university. At first I looked for a job in chemical engineering, didn't get one, worked in a lab as a senior lab technician, did various other kinds of work, and drifted towards the voluntary sector. And then in 1985, I read an advertisement for workers for London's first Black, Lesbian and Gay Centre, perhaps the first such centre in the world. And I thought, this sounds interesting, and I applied and I was appointed. The centre project initially aimed to start up a centre for Black, lesbians and gays, which would provide information, advice and support, as well as educating the wider community and society about Black, lesbians and gays, I think. And over the years, it took us some time to find an actual centre, and then running it didn't prove to be sustainable. It did do a lot of work in terms of providing support, social and cultural activities, and broader awareness raising, for instance, taking part in training others, say public sector workers or students working towards work in the public sector, to understand more about Black, lesbian and gay experiences, including at that time just reminding people of the existence of Black LGBT people, because the scene tended to be very white, and there could be some prejudice, open or concealed, if you went along to a pub or club. And Black movements, groups, communities tended to appear to be very straight. So I think beginning to break down those barriers was important, and simply being there was quite important in that respect. But for a lot of people who would call us or occasionally attend events, it was extremely important to see themselves echoed in some way in other people, to feel that they were not alone, because many had experienced a great deal of isolation, and sometimes that struggle just to imagine one's reality if one never saw any role models. I mean, it was hard enough to find positive role models of Black and minority ethnic people on television anyway, you know, people who weren't fitting some kind of stereotype, you know, whether it's the Asian shopkeeper or some African Caribbean cleaner or whoever. I mean, not that there's anything wrong with being a shopkeeper or cleaner, but the number of roles that were available were extremely limited, and there was often a lot of stereotyping about people's lives, or people were presented as sort of two-dimensional characters. It was hard enough just coming to terms with feeling good about being minority ethnic, let alone feeling positive about one's LGBT identity as well. Yes, London and a number of other cities were changing. Part of that was because of growing community visibility and activism, and finding alliances with some people in the trade union movement and political parties. And this was what happened in Haringey, for instance, and Haringey, some other London boroughs, Greater London, I think to some extent in some of the other major cities in the UK. It was probably less so in quite a lot of other areas, but we began to develop projects. There was more access to funding or support. There was more recognition that local authorities should begin to adopt policies around equal opportunities for everybody, including around sexual orientation. And at that point, equal opportunities was far more contentious than perhaps it is today. I mean, even now you can get something of a backlash against it, but I think for some people at that time, it just seemed a challenge to the notion of the white British character and identity and national pride, and there was, I think, generally a sense that things were changing a lot economically, perhaps. After leaving university, I became quite actively involved in local lesbian and gay rights campaigning, and in that context became involved in some of the activities in Haringey, especially since BLGC, the Black Lesbian and Gay Centre project, initially had offices there, though we were a London-wide organisation. I worked there from 1985 to 94. I was the longest-serving member of staff, and it was a very interesting time. But within Haringey more generally, opportunities were opening up for greater recognition. There were councillors and council officers who were willing to push for greater equality. It was a time when there was also a lot of negativity about equality in general. So having, for instance, just black leaders of councils was a novelty in the UK. Having black people in leadership positions in general was a novelty in the UK. Anti-sexism was regarded with a lot of suspicion. So some of the basics now that would be widely accepted, that there should be provision for survivors of domestic violence, and that it was bad to have open racism and make openly bigoted remarks about some minority or another, was much more questioned at that time, or was much less commonly held. But basically there was a push towards greater equality, but some people strongly resisted that, and some of what now even people who are not very keen on equality would regard as quite acceptable would have been taken as wild examples of the loony left back in the 1980s. So in Haringey, I became involved in helping to set up a lesbian and gay unit and subcommittee. I had become active within Haringey, within a local gay group in Islington and Haringey Gay Group. Joined the committee of that, and that helped to move things forward at a local level, and similar movements were happening in some other boroughs and areas, especially where this involved positive images in schools, changing young people's perceptions so that they would be less prejudiced against schoolmates who were lesbian or gay or whose parents were. This touched off a strong reaction in some people who saw this as somehow subverting schools or teaching children to be gay, as if this were a possibility, given that a lot of us had been taught very vigorously to be heterosexual, and it hadn't actually worked particularly well. So there was I think a lot of exaggerated fear and manufactured outrage. Sections of the media were very active in that. So certain newspapers would have very offensive headlines about gays and lesbians. They wouldn't necessarily use those words. In between their page 3 pictures of women in scanty clothing or whatever. What happened in Haringey involved a lot of argument locally, which was productive, I think. So for perhaps the first time in some areas, people locally were talking about those issues, and you know, in the local media, well, the local papers, face to face, people were talking about the pros and cons of greater acceptance. Those who were against would mobilise and lobby the council, and those of us who were for would also mobilise, lobby the council. There was leafleting in the streets. There was a lot of opportunity for learning. It was quite a turbulent time and some strange scenes, but I was quite active in this. I became a member of Haringey Lesbian and Gay Subcommittee, one of the elected community representatives to that. It was made up partly of councillors and partly of community representatives, including some of us who represented BME, lesbians and gays, which was, I suppose, quite a development at that time, but a recognition to the wider diversity issue that was part of the backdrop. I was also active in an organisation called Positive Images that grew up to counter some of the negativity about having positive images of positive images in schools and colleges in particular, and in the youth service, but more generally the backlash against LGBT inclusion, and Haringey Black Action that made links with other sections of the black community and tried to counter some of the arguments that cropped up in black and minority ethnic circles about how it was about undermining the black family. There was a lot of sensitivity around that at the time, because a lot of policies, for instance, around immigration were very undermining of family life, but just being lesbian or gay was not. And we made the points about it not being some kind of Western or white disease, helped to uncover some of that history of diversity within different communities, and the fact that very often some of the prejudices that were around were things that had been introduced in colonial times, you know, more systematic notions of heterosexuality being the only proper way, that there was only one proper form of gender identity. Some of these were very much about exporting Victorian values to the rest of the world, or in some cases the values of some of the other countries that colonised large swathes of Africa, Asia and Latin America. So Haringey Black Action helped to counter this notion that being lesbian or gay was either some kind of white disease that was negatively affecting our communities. And Positive Images and Haringey Black Action came together to have a march that I think had a wider significance. By about 1986 or 87, what was happening in Haringey was attracting central government attention, and in particular certain leaders of the Conservative Party seized on this, in part to push their own moral agenda, but also because they were out to crack down on local government autonomy and independence and push for far greater central control, as well as certain policies such as privatisation. In this context, there were a number of speeches, for instance, Margaret Thatcher accusing Haringey Council, I think, of teaching children that they had a right to be gay, if I remember rightly. And to the horror of a lot of activists, we found that a notion that had been put forward, and I think initially looked as if it wouldn't be going anywhere, of passing a law to prevent local authorities from promoting homosexuality in inverted commas was going to be taken up by government, and this became the notorious Section 28. So by early 1988, people across England were mobilising against this threat to progress in terms of LGBT acceptance by a law that was designed to outlaw some of what was going on within local government, including the teaching in schools of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship, though the wording ended up being so ambiguous and in some ways garbled that when the law was finally passed, it was never actually used to stop anyone doing anything that they were doing. So some councils carried on with their equal opportunities policies unopposed, but what it did do was impose a kind of chill, especially across the educational sector, that affected a generation of young people after mine. So while there was a lot of negativity around when I was growing up, during that period of 1979 to 82, for instance, when I was at university, here at University College London, and in the 1980s, what then happened was that the progress that had been made, the starting up of youth groups and services and so on, got largely rolled back for young people growing up at the end of the 80s and in the 1990s and at the very beginning of the 2000s, until Section 28 was finally repealed. Well, I was very much active locally within Haringey, and I suppose the Black, Lesbian and Gay Centre project played its part. I wasn't one of the key figures nationally, though I was, I suppose, involved